The President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, constantly sends conflicting signals about the goals of the war against Iran, and it's already hard to understand when he will be ready to stop. At first, he says that there will be no deal with Iran and that he is only waiting for Tehran's surrender, but later he states that surrender could simply mean the weakening of the regime in Tehran. Many have already concluded that the goal of the war is the complete dismantling of the Iranian regime, but Donald Trump himself comes out and declares that he is not against the religious regime itself, but is waiting for it to make a deal with the Americans. And the day before, Trump even declared victory, saying that all the targets in Iran had already been destroyed. But Iran itself is only escalating the war, announcing a complete blockade of the Hormuz Strait and preparing to attack the businesses of the US and Israel. And today the FBI is even warning that Iran might strike California with drones. Conflicting signals from President Trump and his own Pentagon are making allies, markets, and lawmakers wonder how and when the war with Iran will end. Let's discuss the most likely scenarios for ending the war in this episode. My name is Alexei Pichi, and this is my project Conspiracy Theories. Here, together with you, we expose conspiracy theories and try to analyze complex geopolitical processes using simple terms. So, it's obvious that every week without a solution worsens economic problems and instability, increasing the political significance of the situation for Donald Trump ahead of the US midterm elections. On Monday, at the annual Republican meeting, Trump stated that the US has already won this war, but, quote, hasn't won enough. This statement came literally just a few hours after he himself said that the war, quote, is practically over. And after that, his Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, stated that the next day, on the contrary, would become the most intense day of strikes in history. In short, it's easy to get confused. Well, let's discuss the scenarios for ending the war in the Middle East. Scenarios, I emphasize. So, Scenario 1. Let's imagine that an agreement has been reached on a ceasefire and on the nuclear program. The cessation of Iran's nuclear program has been one of the key stated goals of Donald Trump since the beginning of Operation Epic Fury. A few days before the start of the war, Iran and the US held 3 rounds of direct or indirect nuclear talks in Geneva. But in the end, Donald Trump's envoys concluded that Tehran was not serious about the deal. On Monday, Donald Trump stated that in the resumption of negotiations is possible, but he is disappointed by the choice of hardliner Mojtaba to succeed Khamenei as the supreme leader after his father's death. Earlier, let me remind you, Trump said there would be no more negotiations. But there is an inconsistency here because a day before the strikes began, Omani mediators in the negotiations stated that Iran had agreed never to accumulate enriched uranium and called peace achievable. It's not clear how the war will affect future negotiations. Scenario 2. This is the Venezuelan model. Trump pointed to Venezuela, where the US seized President Nicolas Maduro in January and established working relations with his successor, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, as a model for Iran to follow. On the same Monday, Donald Trump stated that, in his opinion, Iran made a big mistake by appointing Mojtaba Khamenei, and he suggested that the new supreme leader might not stay in his position for long. But, to be realistic, it should be noted that aside from the geographical aspect, comparing Iran and Venezuela has significant limitations. Experts say that equating Iran and Venezuela with each other distorts the understanding of the power structure in the Islamic Republic of Iran. The regime has survived for 47 years. Санкций, войн, внутренних восстаний. It has strengthened its position through military, religious, and political institutions designed importantly to outlast any individual leader. The institutions and the system there are already established and well-tuned. If the leader, meaning the head of the entire regime, is eliminated, the institution does not collapse. For Iranian protesters who risk their lives and demand regime change, the emergence of a US-backed leader within the system may be seen more as a betrayal than as liberation. Scenario 3. Popular uprising and regime collapse. The very protests themselves. The risk of regime collapse is real but not inevitable. Ayatollah Khamenei is dead, the economy has collapsed. In Iran, just a few weeks before the war began, the largest protests since the 1979 revolution took place. So the atmosphere seems to suggest that that's why protests could flare up again, and the regime really could fall. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu described the strikes on Iran as creating the conditions for the brave Iranian people to take their freedom into their own hands. But the whole problem is that the Iranian opposition doesn't have a single leader or organized forces on the ground. The exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi is among the most popular opposition figures in the country. But Trump himself downplays his authority, partly because Pahlavi hasn't lived in Iran for almost 50 years. Kurdish forces with support from Israel could provide some assistance on the ground. But the risks are significant, including the possibility that a real civil war could break out in Iran, similar to the one that engulfed Syria for 10 years. Therefore, the Kurds might say sorry, but no. The fourth scenario is a US Special Forces raid on nuclear facilities or a limited ground military operation in Iran. Earlier, Axios reported that the US and Israel discussed the possibility of sending special forces to Iran to physically protect or destroy its stockpiles of highly enriched uranium. Supposedly, the special forces would not go in to overthrow the regime, but to seize those very nuclear facilities. This scenario ends. It ends the war not through political settlement, but by physically eliminating the nuclear threat. But to carry out this mission, troops will be needed in a country that is still actively using ballistic missiles. And the fifth scenario, Trump, as if nothing happened, simply declares victory. He says, "That's it, we won." In this scenario, Trump decides that Iran's missile and drone capabilities have been sufficiently weakened, declares a historic victory, and essentially withdraws American troops from the region, regardless of whether the underlying political situation in Tehran will be resolved. And by the way, the markets are now betting on a quick resolution to the situation, especially considering that the economic difficulties inside the country, that is America, threaten to become a serious political problem for the president, whose party actually hopes to win in the upcoming midterm elections already in November. But Trump himself warned that allowing the wrong leader to come to power would force the US to return to war in 5 years, as he said. That's why just leaving doesn't seem to be an option anymore. Ending the operation may also require support from Israel, which has shown a willingness to act unilaterally and has vowed to eliminate the Iranian nuclear threat through independent action once and for all. As a result, the war in Iran began almost without, as they say, any warning. And perhaps the same can be said about its ending. It could end in a completely unexpected way. Absolutely. And that's exactly why Trump and his team are making the most confusing statements possible about the goals of this war. Write in the comments which scenario you think this war will follow. I realize that these are all just assumptions. We're just discussing it together. So write your assumptions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you found this episode interesting and useful, I ask you to support the work of this YouTube channel financially with any donation or paid subscription using the links and details in the description of this video or by the QR code on your screens. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.